Our scripture reading this morning comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7. It's verses 1 through 17. So I invite you now to listen to the word of our Lord as it may speak to us at this time and in this place. After Jesus had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. A centurion was there that had a slave whom he highly valued, and who was ill and close to death. When he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to him, asking him to come and heal his slave. When they came to Jesus, they appealed to him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy of having you do this for him, for he loves our people. And it is he who built our synagogue for us." And Jesus went with them, but when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to say to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I did not presume to come to you. But only speak the word and let my servant be healed. For I also am a man set under authority with soldiers under me. And I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes. And to my slave, 'Do this,' and the slave does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him, and turning to the crowd that followed him, he said, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. Soon afterwards, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he was approaching the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried off. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow, and with her was a large crowd from the town. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized all of them, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has looked favorably upon his people." This word about him spread throughout Judea and all the surrounding county. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. As we're traveling through Luke here, this passage falls right in between where Jesus gives Luke's account of the Sermon on the Mount, essentially, and John then sending his disciples to ask Jesus if he's the Messiah or not. This man Jesus, is getting quite a reputation. But he isn't doing what people expected him to do or doing what it is people wanted him to do. He's making waves and hanging out with the wrong people and maybe even teaching what they feel is the wrong things. Those of us who've grown up knowing about Jesus and are familiar with him are used to him hanging out with people like tax collectors and lepers and prostitutes. But back then, it must have been pretty strange for Jesus to hang out with these people if he was in fact the Messiah. And to help a Roman centurion, no matter how good of a man that centurion might have been, would be alarming, to say the least, especially if your expectation of the Messiah is that he's going to overthrow the Roman powers in your area. But Jesus goes, and even though he and the Roman here don't meet face to face, Jesus, we're told, is impressed with this faith. And the next thing Jesus does then is he goes and takes care of a widow's son. It's confounding to people like John the Baptist. It's probably confounding to everyone. Jesus doesn't seem to make a distinction between the powerful and the powerless. He doesn't even seem to really care about who's Jewish or who's Gentile. He doesn't seem to care if people believe in him or if they don't. In fact, Jesus doesn't even really seem to care about the rules at all, but at the same time, he cares about people's faith and their well-being. Jesus cares about God and other people. And to be honest, from what I can tell so far as we've journeyed through the Gospel of Luke, that really seems about it. Jesus cares about God, and Jesus cares about other people. Jesus was impressed with the Romans' faith, the overlord, the master, the oppressor. And sure, this one Roman may sound like he's a good, decent, maybe even a great Roman. How good could he possibly be? He's a spoke in a wheel of oppression, part of a machine that will eventually execute Jesus. He is a servant of a system that is systematically crushing people, especially Jewish people. And yet Jesus is impressed with his faith. I can understand why John the Baptist would be a little perplexed by this Jesus, this guy who John says is the axe at the root of the tree, waiting to cut it down. This Jesus, this Messiah that John talked about that is going to baptize us with fire. John even says his winnowing fork is in his hand. He's going to clear the threshing floor and gather the wheat into the granary, but the chaff he's going to burn with an unquenchable fire. And yet, this Jesus that John thought was the Messiah, this Jesus that John wrote those things about, is impressed with the faith of a Roman centurion. That would sound odd to people. That would be perplexing. I wonder if it wouldn't strike people back then the same way as if someone said today that they were impressed in the faith that a terrorist must have. I wonder if Jesus also. I wonder things like if Jesus would be impressed with my faith. That's a humbling question to ask, isn't it? Would Jesus be impressed with our faith? You know, do we really act faithfully? What does that really mean even, to act faithfully? Well, if we look at this Roman that Jesus is impressed with, I mean, we can learn some things about faith, right? The Roman acts humbly. He recognizes Jesus' authority. And he trusts Jesus. That if Jesus can heal his servant, even just by speaking the word. Those are the examples of faith we're getting. And yet the next scene is a scene with a widow who we know nothing about, and we don't know anything about the content of her faith. And she got the same treatment. She gets the same treatment because Jesus was moved by compassion for her. Question, if Jesus would be impressed by my faith. I don't know if that's even important. You know, and I think this is why people don't like reading the Bible, because it can seem really confusing. Because if you take it seriously and really try and figure it out, the Bible leaves us, at least it leaves me with more questions than when I started. And I get then why people were confused and perplexed by Jesus in his time, because honestly, sometimes when I read this stuff, I get confused and perplexed by him too. And so as we're struggling with the story, you know, what sense are we to make of these stories? And I don't know if I know the answer to that. But I do know if we boil down the story to a few basic elements, that there's some things we notice here, right? Like the first one is, the only thing that this Roman and this widow have in common, besides the fact that they both are in the process of losing somebody that they care about and need, the only thing that they have in common, really, is that they're both outsiders, right? He's an outsider by being powerful, and she, the widow, is an outsider by being powerless, if I can say that word. Powerless. There we go. And yet what happens in the story is weird and amazing. I mean, Jesus goes to both of them and he cares for both of them. To Jesus, it doesn't seem to really matter who they are or whether they have an impressive faith or whether we can't determine anything about their faith at all. Jesus doesn't seem to care about things that would normally be qualifiers on people. And you know, today we live in a world where there are a lot of outsiders. There are a lot of outsiders. And we've even had times where each of us in our own lives have been made to feel like an outsider or like we don't belong, right? I would bet there are times in each of our lives where we felt powerful, and I bet there are times in our lives where we felt completely powerless. I bet there are times in our lives where we felt completely faithful, and there are times in our life where we felt completely faithless. But all of us know what it feels like to be an outsider. The labels and lines and definitions we might give today might be a little bit different than the ones in Jesus' time. We might not wear labels anymore like Roman or widow, But we still draw distinctions among each other. We still cast people as outsiders. We try and divide and define people by social status or nationality or race or political affiliation or even by religion. And even in each religion, there are divisions in that. Even in being a Presbyterian, there are different divisions on that. There are thousands of different ways we try and create this insider and outsider mentality. But Jesus is telling us that none of this really matters. Jesus is telling us none of that really defines who we are. Here's Jesus showing us that it doesn't even matter if you're full to the brim with faith and you impress him like a Roman centurion does, or if your faith's been rocked by loss and sorrow like the widow's has. No, to Jesus, the only things that really seem to matter are God and other people. Nothing else seems to matter to Jesus. And so then I wonder then, when we live in a world like ours that is so divisive, and as we all grow suspicious of those we've determined as being other, as we look upon people as outsiders, as we all do, I wonder what it would take for us to be a little bit more like Jesus. To live as though the greatest concern in our lives were God and other people. I wonder how different this world would be if just Christians prioritized the two concerns that Jesus had above everything else. I wonder what would happen if beyond everything that threatens to tear us apart, if we looked at the common humanity of each person and understood their relationship to God. The Jewish theologian Martin Buber wrote this book that I read in college. He wrote it in the 30s. I wasn't in college in the 30s, but that absolutely blew me away. It's this book called I and Thou, right? And Buber in this book, he's a Jewish theologian, he puts forward in this book that God is in the relationship that we have with people, if it's a true relationship. In fact, Buber takes that a step further. He says God is this relationship where we're in a true relationship with people. When we cease to see them as objects or an I-it relationship, and we enter into a relationship where they are fully known to us and we are fully known to them, this I-you relationship or I-thou relationship, as Buber calls it because he's old, so he uses thou. But God then, Buber says, is this connection between people when we look past things like labels and definitions and characteristics and we see as a whole person. Buber puts it like this. He uses a tree as an example. He says, I contemplate a tree. I can accept it as a picture, a rigid pillar in a flood of light or splashes of green traversed by the gentleness of this blue-silver background. I can feel it as movement. The flowing veins around the sturdy, striving core, the sucking of the roots, the breathing of the leaves, the infinite commerce with earth and air, and the growing itself in its darkness. I can assign it to a species and observe it as an instance with an eye to its construction and its way of life. I can overcome its uniqueness and form so rigorously that I can recognize it only as an expression of law, those laws according to which a constant opposition of forces is continually adjusted, or those laws according to which the elements mix and they separate. I can dissolve it into a number, into a pure relation between numbers and eternalize it. Throughout all of this, the tree remains my object, and it has a place and its time span, its kind and condition. But it can also happen, Buber writes, it can also happen if will and grace are joined, that as I contemplate the tree, I'm drawn into a relation, and this tree ceases to be an it. The power of exclusiveness has seized me. He says that this does not require me to forego any of the modes of contemplation. There's nothing that I must not see in order to see. There's no knowledge that I must forget. Rather is everything. It's everything. Picture and movement, species and instance, law and number included and inseparably fused. Whatever belongs to the tree is included. Its form and mechanics, its color and its chemistry, its conversation with the elements and its conversation with the stars, all this in its entirety. He says the tree is no impression, no play of my imagination, no aspect of mood. It confronts me bodily and has to deal with me as I must deal with it, only differently. One should not try to dilute the meaning of relation. Relation is reciprocity. Does the tree of consciousness, similar to our own, Buber asks? I have no experience of that. What I encounter is neither the soul of a tree nor a dryad, but the tree itself. For Buber, connecting with God, being in relation with God, being aware of God, making God important, comes from being able to see people as whole people, of trying to know somebody and allowing them to know you. Not your labels, not your characteristics, not your components or parts, not what you look like. I mean, all of that is kind of included, but knowing you for the you-ness that is you. Knowing someone as a whole person. Buber says when we enter into that kind of relationship, when we learn the whole story of somebody, or see someone in their wholeness, that's where we find God. Right? And so then maybe the truth then of the story, maybe what the story is trying to get us to understand about Jesus was Jesus saw past things like Roman centurion, and he saw past things like widow. And what he did then was he saw a real person with real suffering who had real needs, and he ran to meet them. He ran to go help them. He encounters the personhood of each individual for what they are and for who they are as they are. Are we then not called to do the same? To take each person as they are and who they are, and then care for them the best we can. I mean, we're about to have communion. Isn't that what that meal is all about? That everyone is welcome to this table to receive this meal, to encounter and get God's grace no matter what condition or label we might be wearing? Can there really be any outsiders? I mean, really? Can there really be any outsiders when it comes to God or God's grace? Is there really room for dividing walls around one table? And you see, the longer I do this church thing, the longer I see it done well, and I see it done poorly in some cases, there's one thing I've really become convinced of. And what I've become convinced of is that what we do around this table, when we gather around this table together, it becomes like a practice run or a test to show us how we're supposed to live our lives the rest of the time. I think what we do here in what we call church is a practice run and an example of how we're supposed to live our lives outside of these walls. I mean, if we who are many different people, who wear many different labels, who believe many different things, who live, in some cases, vastly different lives, if we can come here and form a community and gather around one table, putting all those other things aside, if we can really do this thing we call church here, if we can form a community based on something deeper and more meaningful, if we can really allow ourselves to be known and to know each other as a church, if we can do that here, then that means we know how to do that. And then that means we can go and do that out there. If we can extend things like grace and love and welcoming here, then we should be willing and able to do it when we're out there. If we really want to be like Jesus and God and other people are top priorities in here in the church, then why can't they be priorities out there? Why can't God and other people be priorities for us out there as well? If Christ can invite people to come as they are, no matter what, if Christ can invite people to come just as they are and gather around one table in here, then we should be willing to invite other people to our tables as they are as well. And if we can set that example, if just the people in this room can set that example, if we can begin that process, if we can be like Jesus and have our ultimate concern be in God and in other people, then I promise you, not only will your life get better, I promise you that the world will get better. I promise you that. That if we put God and other people as our ultimate concern, our lives will get better, our world will get better, and not only will it get better, but it'll be a safer place for everyone. Amen. I'm supposed to go to the communion table now. So now it is that we gather around this table. In language throughout the years,